thus to exclude them from the rank of errors. But Christ warns us against them all, without excluding any toga. Not only Christ's words, but those of all Hebrew prophets, of John the Baptist, and of all the truly wise men who have ever lived, have referred to this same church, this same government, culture, civilization, etc., calling them evils and the causes of man's perdition. For instance, suppose an architect were to say to the owner of a house, "Your house is in a bad state, it must be wholly rebuilt," and were then to go on giving all the necessary details about the kind of beams that would be required, how they were to be cut and where placed. If the owner were to turn a deaf ear to the architect's words about the ruinous condition of the house and the necessity for its being rebuilt, and were only to listen with a feigned interest to the secondary details concerning the proposed repairs, the architect's counsels would evidently appear but so much useless talk. And if the owner happened to feel no great respect for the builder, he would call his advice foolish. This is exactly what occurs with the teaching of Christ. I use this simile for want of a better one, and I remember that Christ, while preaching his doctrine, used one very like it. He said, "I will destroy your temple, and within 3 days I will build up another." He was crucified for these words. His doctrine is crucified for the same reason up to the present time. The least that can be required of those who judge another man's teaching is that they should take the teacher's words in the exact sense in which he uses them. Christ does not consider his teaching as some high ideal of what mankind should be but cannot attain to, nor does he consider it as a chimerical, poetical fantasy, fit only to captivate the simple-minded inhabitants of Galilee. He considers his teaching as work, a work that is to save mankind. His suffering on the cross was no dream. He groaned in agony and died for his teaching. And how many people have died and will still die in the same cause? Such teaching cannot be called a dream. Every doctrine of truth is a dream for those who are in error. We have come to such a state of error that there are many among us who say, as I did myself formerly, that this doctrine of Christ is chimerical because it is incompatible with the nature of man. It is incompatible with the nature of man, they say, to turn the other cheek when he has been struck. It is incompatible with the nature of man to give up his property to another, to work not for himself but for others. It is natural to man, they say, to protect himself, his own safety, that of his family and his property. In other words, it is the nature of man to struggle for life. Learned lawyers prove scientifically that the most sacred duty of a man is to protect his rights, that is, to struggle. We need only for one moment to cast aside the idea that the present organization of our lives, as established by man, is the best and most sacred, and then the argument that the teaching of Christ is incompatible with human nature immediately turns against the arguer. Who will deny that it is repugnant and harrowing to a man's feelings to torture or kill not only a man but also even a dog, a hen, or a calf? I have known men living by agricultural labour who have ceased entirely to eat meat only because they had to kill their own cattle. And yet our lives are so organized that for one individual to obtain any advantage in life, another must suffer, which is against human nature. The whole organization of our lives, the complicated mechanism of our institutions, whose sole object is violence, are but proofs of the degree to which violence is repugnant to human nature. No judge will ever undertake to strangle with his own hands the man whom he has condemned to death. No magistrate will himself drag a peasant from his weeping family in order to shut him up in prison. Not a single general, not a single soldier, would kill hundreds of Turks or Germans and devastate their villages. No, not one of them would consent to wound a single man, were it not in war, and in obedience to discipline and the oath of allegiance. Cruelty is only exercised, thanks to our complicated social machinery, when it can be so divided among a number that none shall bear the sole responsibility or recognize how unnatural all cruelty is. Some make laws, others apply them. Others again drill their fellow creatures into habits of discipline, that is, of senseless passive obedience. And these same disciplined men in their turn do violence to others, killing without knowing why or wherefore. But let a man even for a moment shake off in thought the net of worldly institutions that so ensnares him, and he will see what is really incompatible with his nature. If once we cease to affirm that the evil we are so used to and profit by is an immutable divine truth, we may see clearly which is the more natural to man, violence or the law of Christ. Which is better, to know that the comfort and safety of my family and myself, all my joys and pleasures, are obtained at the price of the misery, depravity, and suffering of millions, by yearly executions, by hundreds of thousands of suffering prisoners, and by millions of soldiers, policemen, and sergeants, torn from their homes and half stupefied by military discipline, who protect my idle pleasures by keeping starving men at a distance with their loaded pistols. To know that every dainty morsel I put into my mouth or give my children is obtained at the price of all this suffering, which is inevitable in order to obtain those dainties. Or to know that my fare is my own, that nobody suffers for the want of it, and that nobody has suffered in procuring it for me. It is sufficient to comprehend, once and for all, that in our present organization of life, every joy and every moment of peace is bought at the cost of the privations and sufferings of thousands, who are only restrained by violence, in order to see clearly what is natural to man, that is, not only to the animal nature of man, but to the rational nature as well. It is sufficient to understand the doctrine of Christ in all its high significance and with all the consequences it entails, to see that it is not inconsistent with human nature, but that, on the contrary, his whole doctrine throws aside what is inconsistent with human nature, the delusive human teaching of resistance of evil, which is the chief cause of all human misery. The doctrine of Christ, which teaches us not to resist evil, is a dream. But the sight of men in whose breasts love and pity are innate, spending their lives in burning their brethren at the stake, scourging them, breaking them on the wheel, lashing, slitting their nostrils, putting them to the rack, keeping them fettered, sending them to the galleys or the gallows, shooting them, condemning to solitary confinement, imprisoning women and children, organizing the slaughter of tens of thousands by war, bringing about periodical revolutions and rebellions. The sight of others passively fulfilling these atrocities, the sight of others again writhing under these tortures or avenging them, this is no dream. When once we clearly understand the teaching of Christ, we see that it is not the world given by God to man for his happiness that is a dream, but the world such as men have made it for their own destruction that is a wild, terrifying dream, the delirium of a madman, a dream from which it is enough to awake